Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. My name is Emma, and I have Nick with me today. And we're going to be talking about the world of UX and kind of how some of that might be shifting and changing as we dive more into technology moving forward. But before I get to all the questions that I have for you, Nick, can you give everybody an introduction?
Hi, everybody. My name is Nick. Thank you for having me, Emma. I'm located here in San Francisco Bay Area. Today is a little bit muggy, fall back to school weather, but we are in a rhythm of the new calendar or new school year. I've been in the Bay Area for about 40-ish years now. My parents moved here in the early 1980s when they wanted to expand their horizons and find a different culture and community than the one that they had left in Winnipeg, Canada. I was born into an age where Apple computer was right down the road and had the luxury of having the early versions of Mac and Apples at my fingertips growing up. I was always an artistic kid. I had sort of encouraging parents that sent me to art camps over the summer and encouraged that development of visual arts. And accompanying that was technical literacy, was I had, again, the tools and the privilege to be able to do art on the computer all throughout high school. I remember pirating the first version of Adobe Photoshop on a floppy disk and taking it home for my school's computer lab, which dates both me and Adobe Photoshop accordingly. And, so I came out of college, the University of Oregon, Big Ten powerhouse school, for those of you who are in Wisconsin listening. And I came back to the Bay Area in the early 2000s to find that this intersection of art and technology was happening on a scale and at a level that I hadn't anticipated. This thing called the World Wide Web was still in its infancy. And, companies like Google and Yahoo were still just getting started. And so I was able to find a niche in there. Instead of doing design, whether it be drawing or graphic design, it was now user interface design, where you were applying design to software and screens. And that was all fine and good. That went well for a while. And then around 2008, 2010, the advent of this notion called user experience, because if you remember the assessment of Apple computers or early iPhones were that it just works. It just had the ability to not make me think about what I had to do, and I could click my way through and get to where I needed to go. And that was the experience. It really didn't have as much to do with the screens themselves as it did the information and the steps and the notifications involved with bringing a user through a process. And that's where I've been ever since. But as we might allude to in this conversation, the nature of user experience is changing quite a bit, just as we saw this influx and explosion of a transformation in the early 2000s and then in the 2010s. We're seeing one again here over the next 18 to 24 months. And so I'm sure that's where we want to play with a bit today, because, again, it causes us all to rethink how we address our careers as well as how we address change.
Yeah, definitely. So while you and I were kind of prepping for this conversation, you spoke about the idea that UX often kind of finds this role of being the interpreter between different teams and different departments. So can you walk through a little bit about how that really impacts the success of change?
Yeah, the difference between UI and UX is a humanist element. Experience is not something that's subjective. It should be seen as objective, where as a practitioner, we're responsible for going out and bringing in that humanist element through qualitative research, through understanding of surveys and results, and to be able to advocate for the end user in a user-centric design process to say, hey, they're getting confused here, or this is unclear, or this is something that's bringing joy and delight. And therefore, we should design our practices and principles around that. An example that is often used, but I'll bring it up again, is the early days of ride sharing, back before the robots took control, where this notion of I am going to get into a car with a stranger, despite everything my parents told me growing up. Now it's become socially acceptable to jump into a car with somebody you don't know. And that hesitancy was real. We didn't know what that felt like. And if you remember the Uber application, one of the early versions, you saw an animation of little cars moving around. And what did that do? That was a UI element, but it provided user experience for the end user who may have shunned adoption of this technology, it gave them affirmation that A, all these people are writing in them. You can see the yellow animations, which were fake, by the way. And B, the convenience of it means there's somebody around the corner from me, when in fact there was not. And the most embarrassing element of catching a taxi cab, you would also have to stand on the curb and wave your arm in the air and try to hail down a taxi. These are concepts that really sort of just scream vulnerabilities and would easily be avoided if possible. And so again, understanding the emotions that the human being goes through when needing a place to go, when needing an estimation of time, when wanting clarity of where the car was, as well as an affirmation that other people were using it. It's a great early example of how, again, I know you work in growth, Emma, is that how that sort of growth metric was played upon because of a good UX. Yeah, and it's our job to interpret and negotiate requirements and implementation. That is a user experience role, is the delegator.
Yeah. Well, so now that we have all of these tools available, there's a lot of overlap between like what UX has traditionally done, what other teams have done, what people might be capable of. Like, how do we lead through this transition to determine kind of who's responsible for what?
Yeah, and that, if we're all using the same tools, if we're all in the same prompt and using the same algorithm, how do we figure out whose job is what? Whereas I can be an engineer if I can get my prompt right, and a product manager can be a designer if they know what libraries to pull from. And we've always seen this, is that with the technical literacy increasing, with the advent of these SaaS platforms, with the patternization of whether it be web-based tools or system design libraries, is that we can start to play in each other's space. But that overlap is something that we need to understand the core competencies in which we bring to the table. And if we, as UX practitioners, speak in the voice of the user, it gives us a unique value proposition where we can always make sure that what we're advocating for isn't the speed of the code, of the ease of implementation, or in the case of PMs, the fulfilling of requirements or the meeting of metrics, but instead we're sort of keeping our conversation in the voice of the user. And one way to gain credibility and authority in that is to make sure you're constantly embedded in the feedback loops, whether it's something that exists with the corporation or something that you create on your own.
So with the introduction then of these tools and how, like, let's talk through how we focus on the human element that kind of comes along with all of this and continue to think through how will humans add value as all of our roles shift and change. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we see a lot of SaaS companies, early stage startups that have outreach or different propositions for taking our subscription money. And from time to time, I see one that has a link to book a conversation with the CEO. And I find that to be a wonderful ethos. And I typically, because I'm a researcher myself, I always cook on it. And I take time to tell the CEO how I'm using the product differently than how they intended, where my prioritization of features that I would like to see done might be, as well as to thank them for introducing this to their culture early on in the company's formation, where they want to know and form relationships with their best user or all their users, because they use that signal as a way of wayfinding for their product going forward. And I think that is something that's often missing. I mean, yes, there are sales. Sales is speaking with existing customers or potential customers, but it's much more of a transactional conversation. It's not so much of one about vulnerability or confusion or delight or all these sort of adoption metrics, things that may harm or improve adoption. And those tend to be around experiences where, again, you're not trying to win their business, you're trying to ease their pain. And that's a part of culture that can be formed from a company early on. When I've worked for DevOps or system administrator focused companies, it was hard to get these voices because those job titles tend to be fairly recluse and an avoiding of solicitation. And so what we would do is we'd go to conferences and set up a booth, and then I'd spend time on LinkedIn and Twitter back then, trying to figure out who was going to these conferences and who were the people that I could meet to talk about their experiences with either our product or a neighboring product, or even just their workflow in general, and try to make those contacts and connections that, again, weren't trying to be sales pitches. They were trying to inform how we were going to shape and design the product going forward. So for those of you who are early stage, or even at the heads of your organizations, try to build in those feedback cycles that aren't transactional based, but that are helping inform and provide a voice of candor and an unbiased perspective of where the product should go and how we should prioritize the next quarter or year going forward.
Thank you so much for joining me for the discussion, Nick, and for everybody who's joined us. Make sure you get connected with Nick on LinkedIn and reach out to either one of us if you have any questions. But I appreciate your time, and thank you again for joining me, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks, Emma.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Leading Change. If you like what you saw, be sure to come back on a weekly basis and subscribe for more expert interviews focused on digital transformation, change management, and emerging technologies.